how long everybody takes. So it might take 2 weeks instead of one for us to reconvene. Apart from going through what we're going to do with these nodes and how we're going to set them up, I am presenting you with the main question, the main decision that you're going to have to take, ideally before the week is over. And that is, how do you want to run your node? What kind of device are you looking at? Or if you want to put it in the cloud, then what kind of budget do you allocate for yourself, and what kind of setup what do you want to achieve with this? This is we're going to have a lot of flexibility in how we set these things up. So we don't need to all use the same configurations. We don't need to all use the same devices. We do have enough. We do have the ability to kind of think for ourselves whether we want our node to be full archival nodes, or we want them to be pruned, or whether we want to use neutrino. And so first, we're going to have to think about whether we want to put them in the cloud or on a physical device at home or in the office. And this is, this might appear to be the most difficult decision that we're going to have to make. And it largely depends on what you want to do with this device, what kind of space you have at home, at the office, what kind of availability of electricity and like internet stability you have, and also eventually what you want to build on top of it, or what you want to use this for. The main advantage of a BPS is that it's very stable and very easy to maintain. You don't have to worry about hardware questions ever. You don't have to worry about fire risk. You don't have to worry about the device kind of getting out of date or the hard drive failing. You pay a company a certain amount of dollars every month. So LunaNode, which is the provider I tend to suggest, mainly because they accept Lightning and I use them myself. There's many others. I would expect to pay around maybe, let's say, $10 per month for a small but reliable Lightning node, including a Bitcoin node and maybe something on top of it. It's a huge advantage if you want to build services on top of this node. For example, services that let you receive through your own Lightning address, because a lot of these services are going to depend on domains. They're going to depend on having somebody being able to kind of reach your server through the open internet rather than through Tor. And so that's kind of the main advantage of a VPS. If you're planning to put services on top of it, so for example, for payment processing, such as BTC Pay, or all these cool little usability hacks like LNURL that LNbits provides you, then a VPS is definitely the way to go. It's by far the easiest and most reliable to point a domain name at this VPS, have a static IP address, or even multiple IP addresses, have IPv6 and IPv4. You're still going to be able to add Tor to that, but in your home network, your ability to kind of receive ClearNet transactions might be very much hindered by your ISP's configuration, by your home routing node, by your home router. And these are all things that we don't really want to get into. It can be, so setting up a node at home, the way we are going to do it, meaning Tor only, makes it very easy to run this in any kind of network at home. We won't have to worry about what kind of router we're using. We don't have to worry about what ISP we're using. We don't even need that fast internet. But we can very easily move this device. So as long as we're behind Tor, we can move apartments as often as we need. We can even take it on our travels if we need to. We don't have to worry about IP addresses changing or about the router configurations. But as a downside, it's going to be difficult to point, for example, a payment processor at this node or a web application. And that also makes it difficult to use something like a Lightning address with this node, or to use this node for for the integration in other kind of like web applications. It's still going to be easy for us to make use of this node on a mobile phone or in a web browser. So that's perfectly fine if that's what you want. And we're going to go through on how to set this up. But in short, if you want to build on top of this node, if you want to develop applications or use this for professional payment processing, then you are probably better off with a node in the cloud. There is a bit of an in-between. Let me first go through the advantages of a node at home. So it's probably a node at home, meaning a computer or a laptop. Doesn't have to be brand new, can easily be 5, 6, 7, 8 years old. Those are still going to work fine. That's going to come closest to our idea of self-sovereignty, because it is a machine. We're installing the operating system on it ourselves. We control the keys. We control the entire device. There isn't really anybody who can mess with us unless they have physical access to our home, which is something that we're relatively familiar with in controlling. So our VPS in the cloud has a much more obscure security access policies, where we kind of need to trust the VPS provider with making sure that no unauthorized access is being made to our nodes. Of course, we can do our best to secure them from threats from the open internet, but we're going to have a hard time securing them against threats at home. Similar to our home node, that we aren't able to very well secure against threats that are kind of coming from inside of our home. So if we live in a dorm, if we frequently have like untrusted strangers in our building that have access maybe to the place where the node is, then a home node might also not be like the greatest from a security perspective. I think when it comes to cost, the home node is a lot more affordable because because they tend to last relatively long at a good price, especially if we are able to utilize kind of like old hardware. So if we already have an old laptop lying around, and let's say the resale value of that laptop is only in the $200 to $300 range, then that amortizes itself against a VPS within a year or 2 or 3 years, and that's tends to be a relatively affordable option to run a node. The cheapest options are probably you can imagine these workstations that companies constantly get rid of, like these Dell workstations or Lenovo workstations. You can get them for less than 200 Canadian dollars, refurbished on Amazon, and they tend to be more than powerful enough to run a Lightning node. What you might have to add in these cases is you have to look out if they come with Wi-Fi cards. You have to look out if they come with a hard drive, and often they barely have a hard drive, and they definitely don't have an SSD. So I wrote this into these requirements too. It's also on the site. We have here the kind of like optimal and good hardware recommendations. I'll post it here in the chat group as well. Meaning 8 GB of RAM is pretty good. If you have a Lightning node running in that, you're not going to run into any issues. Your Bitcoin node is going to sync relatively quickly. If you go below that, you're going to notice that things take a bit longer. But and that maybe if you have, let's say, only 2 GB of RAM, then your node might not handle a lot of channels, for example. It might not handle a lot of routing activity simply because it's going to be too slow to respond. But it is going to, my main spending node is a 2 GB RAM. So I run a node on the bare minimum. I have been told that I'm quite daring to do this, but I have not really run into any hardware issues. So if you want to go with the bare minimum, it's really it's really, let me type this up. The bare minimum is 2 GB of RAM and 1 virtual CPU. And in the bare minimum, you don't even need extra storage because in the bare minimum, you don't run Bitcoin Core because you will kind of connect to the open Bitcoin network. But yeah, there are a lot of performance trade-offs that you're making in that this node is not going to be able to run additional applications on top of it. You might be able to run BTC Pay then on a separate server and connect to your node, which is quite attractive. But then that's a second VPS that you're running. The storage requirements are kind of the most difficult to formulate. If you are running a VPS, then storage can become very expensive. And even just paying for an extra, let's say 25 gigabyte in SSD storage on a VPS can cost you half as much as you pay for the actual node. I don't know exactly why SSDs are so expensive in data centers. They tend to be much, much cheaper at home. So buying a 1 terabyte SSD and running that for a year at home is probably cheaper than buying and then renting 20 gigabyte of storage in a VPS. So if you have a device at home and you do want to make full use of your Bitcoin Core's nodes feature, then if you can splurge on a terabyte SSD of good quality, then it definitely pay off. You'll be able to keep the entire Bitcoin blockchain. You'll be able to save yourself a lot of time if you ever have to do any rescans. And you'll be able to also then easily plug other applications into it later. For example, if you want to connect your Sparrow wallet or run your own Electrum server, these kind of benefits then also come from having a node at home, having a Bitcoin Core node at home, being able to connect to that and use it to kind of privately look up how many Bitcoin have you received on chain, and being able to spend them and broadcast them through your own node. The uptime guarantee is important if you want to be a routing node. It's important if you want to run applications on top of it. And yes, these data centers tend to be more reliable than your build at home, but the difference doesn't have to be very big. So if you do have access to, let's say you're in an office building where you do have access to 2 ISPs, then you can expect similar uptime as in a data center. The uptime doesn't matter as much if you're using it just for your personal spending, but of course it is very frustrating if you're standing if you found one of these rare coffee shops and restaurants that accept Bitcoin and you're standing there and you realize your node is down for whatever reason. So yeah, when it comes to internet at home, if that's a bit spotty, then that's usually fine as long as it's not like constantly cutting in and out. If you have a few minutes outage per day, there's absolutely no harm in that. Your node can safely have its internet cut multiple times a day or even multiple hours at a time without there being any risk to your funds or any risk to your nodes. But electricity availability is quite important, mainly because if your electricity is cut, then you might have, and your node is currently undergoing some write intensive operation, then there is the risk of data loss, either because the memory kind of is shut down or because this write operation is interrupted, and then you end up with a corrupted database on your SSD. And those can be quite frustrating to recover from. So having stable electricity at the point of your node is relatively important, while having stable internet is not so important. There is so the thing in between tends to be a professional machine. They're also sometimes called home servers, even though they're not really used much at home. They're used more in small offices. And if you have those with a commercial ISP, rather than like a residential ISP, then you can achieve similar availability and similar reliability and connectivity as if you were in a data center. You might not have the same kind of ping times, you might not have the same kind of connectivity to other applications, but in a peer-to-peer network, that's really not important. So I think there are people in here listening who are thinking about setting a node in their office. If you are deciding on good hardware and you plug this straight into the Ethernet port, then definitely go for that over a VPS, because you are going to benefit from having a static IP address, and you are going to benefit from having a stable internet connection. And and of course, if you run a web application, then maybe that's better hosted in a data center, simply because of how data is routed around the internet and how kind of all these content delivery networks are connecting to each other. But for your Lightning node, the physical proximity to other data centers is not important at all. So feel free to embrace that option. Then maybe this is a good time for question, or maybe this is a good point for people to maybe even, if you want to propose, if you have an idea of something that you're not quite sure about whether it's going to work or whether it's suitable, then maybe now is a good time to raise that. As I said, yes, please.
Hey, who's the VPS host that you were talking about?
So I was talking about LunaNode. Eric has posted the link in there. It's a Toronto-based VPS provider that accepts Lightning and has been. They are the one hosting Wallet of Satoshi, and they're also hosting the majority of BTC Pay servers are out there. So if you search, for example, 1ML by location, and you're going to find all their nodes. So they are a relatively well-tested and trusted VPS provider. They probably don't have the same kind of reliability and uptime as DigitalOcean would have, or Amazon or Azure, but more than suitable for a Lightning node.
Leo, question?
Yes.
I'm thinking about using a computer at home. Is it possible to use like that service Dyn, Dyn.com to assign a domain, or get a static IP for a non-static IP device or something? Have you heard of that?
Yes. So there's like, what is it? The distributed what is it called? There's so if you're running a device at home and you want to make it available over ClearNet, then you are mainly need to ask yourself if you have a static IP address at home. And if you have a static IP address at home, then there's not really anything you need. You just need to configure your router at home to kind of forward the relevant ports from the public IP that the router is assigned to your machine. And that's not very difficult. There's probably going to be, depending on what you're running, 2 or 3 ports. But if you have a dynamic IP address, then the question is again, what do you want to use with it? So for the Bitcoin and the Lightning Network, having a changing IP address is no problem at all. Your node is just going to, let's say, once a day or once a week announce a new IP address for itself. But that doesn't tend to cause problems. It does cause problems if you want to connect a domain to your node, for example, because on your node you also want to run a website, or because you do want to run LNbits or BTC Pay, or you want to make use of something that assigns you a Lightning address. And in that case, if you don't have a static IP address, you can use these dynamic, they're called dynamic DNS. I think that's what DDNS is.
I think I found Dyn.com. DYN.com.
Yeah, this probably stands for like dynamic something. There are a few services out there, and they usually require you to run a little piece of software on your machine. tends to be just a little script, so easy to verify that it's not like something nefarious. And the script will just every minute or every 10 minutes ping their server with a key, and the server will then kind of check what's your IP address and then dynamically update your DNS records. For a Lightning address or for an LNbits that you use personally, I think that's totally suitable. The kind of downsides of these services is you risk having like a 10-minute unavailability if your IP address changes, but the dynamic DNS provider doesn't yet pick up on it. So that's not suitable if you're really running a professional service on top of it. If you want to use your node at home to, for example, professionally process Bitcoin payments at your, let's say, your bar, then maybe that's not like a great solution, because you might run, depending on how often you get a new IP address, you might run into a connectivity issue for 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks.
I have a quick question. I'm currently running my node, and I'm thinking about whacking it just because I've had some issues with it over some time. And so I'm thinking of using that box for this. What do we run? What are we going to run on there? Or what would I set it up with? Does that make sense?
There's Leo.
I think he's back. If you can hear us, and please feel free to ask your question again about my note.
Oh yeah, no, I got bumped out.
Yeah, I think we all did.
Oh, all right. Yeah, so I'm running my node, and I've just had some issues with it over, since I've run it, from way back when. And so I'm thinking of just like using that box and just wiping it and starting over fresh.
What kind of machine is it? Like, is it a Raspberry Pi?
Yeah, it's a Raspberry Pi. It's got I want to say it's an 8 gigabyte. I kind of forget
so
some of
probably
the
the
details.
Raspberry Pi 4.
Yeah.
It probably has 4 gigabyte RAM or 8.
Yeah.
So I have one of them too, and things work well. Somehow it is a bit at the lower end of what runs smoothly. I would stick with that device. I would install like Raspbian on it, which is Debian kind of tailored to the Raspberry Pi. And I would strongly recommend anybody who runs Raspberry Pi or similar to run the operating system off from a USB stick rather than a SD card. That's the biggest issue I've seen with Raspberry Pis, is that SD cards aren't really made for a lot of read and write operations. They're really great if you have a camera and you fill up that SD card with photographs. But if you have a Lightning node and the Lightning node needs to constantly write and read from that SD card, then the SD card breaks after just a few months. So you can run the Raspberry Pi 4 very easily from a USB stick. And I would recommend to run the operating system on that USB stick and then have an external SSD. So for example, like what is called the SATA M2, they're little, you can sometimes even just screw them to the bottom of the Raspberry Pi. And then get a proper SSD there, maybe even a terabyte SSD, and then put the Lightning node data and the Bitcoin node data on that external SSD. Because in the event that so these Raspberry Pis, mine is running really well for over a year now, but there seem to be like some quality differences between them. And I've seen some of them break after just a few months. And if your data is on an external SSD, then it's very easy to recover and very easy to just plug that into a different computer. And within a few hours, you can already get started again and ideally have your channels running again.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
So what I would kind of ask you to, if you haven't yet found your device, you can head over to Amazon and look at kind of refurbished Dell or Lenovo computer or anything really that these workstations just tend to be relatively cheap because people don't want to, they're not very popular for people's homes, and big corporations, they buy them by the thousands and then just like give them away after a year, sometimes even unused. The alternative is to go to a used computer store and just pick up any kind of old laptop. So the Lenovo laptops tend to be very good, but Acer, HP, like it's pretty much all the same. Old MacBooks theoretically work, but there's a lot of they're not very well supported by Ubuntu. So if you're running an old so Mac Minis are also really great. If you're running an old MacBook or a Mac Mini, then it is better to stick with Mac OS X. So better to stick them with the Apple operating system, which everything's gonna pretty much work on Apple too. We're just gonna have to look at like adjusting some of the commands because not all these commands are exactly the same and all the paths are going to be different. Windows is something where theoretically it should work. If you're a Windows enthusiast and you want to run a Lightning node on Windows, then you can totally do this. And I will support you even if it's mainly for the oddity factor. Because you'll be the odd one out in the world of Lightning, it could be, if you are an enthusiast, it could be very fun to try out because theoretically everything should work. You should be able to install Go. You should be able to compile. So Bitcoin runs very smoothly on Windows, being originally a Windows project. Lightning originally more of a Linux project. Pretty much all implementations are native to Linux, but they do, or at least they should compile on Windows just as well. Eric, curious if you've tried to run that. It should work relatively well. The Ubuntu for Raspberry Pi should work relatively well in its server version. I have had bad luck with it otherwise. The other guide that you might want to even just like bookmark it now is how to create a USB stick for your for this computer. So you have, let's say, step one is finding the device. That's an old laptop. That's a refurbished desktop. That's maybe a Raspberry Pi. That could be even something like an Android TV that you're no longer using. These Android TVs, they tend to have great like GPU acceleration, which works really well with like all the cryptographic things. But we will have to, no matter what device we choose, unless you. So if it's an Apple device, stick with Apple simply because that's going to cause you by far the least troubles, not because it's the best operating system to run this on. The next thing is you're going to have to install, we're going to recommend Ubuntu, but Debian is pretty much exactly the same thing. So if you want something that feels a bit more raw, then Debian is pretty much exactly the same. Pretty much all the packages and everything we need is going to be available for Debian as easily. And to do that, we're going to need to first create like what's called a live USB. So that's a USB stick on which you install the operating system. And this USB stick can then be plugged into the Raspberry Pi and the computer. And then theoretically, the operating system could be run from that USB stick. And that's preferable if you run on a Pi or similar. But if you have a solid computer, then you might as well install the operating system on that computer. And to do that, you need to be able to enter the BIOS. So the BIOS is that program that loads your operating system. And it's something that's usually kind of fixed installed in your computer. It's not something that you can easily replace or mess with. It's very often when you load up your computer, it kind of quickly shows you a screen that says, maybe it tells the name of your computer, or maybe it just says like, maybe it just flashes a few lights. Often it comes with a quick notice that says click F12 or click F1 to enter advanced settings or to enter boot settings. And that's where you're going to have to find on whatever device you're going to use for your Lightning node. You're going to have to find a way to access this BIOS menu. On some devices, this BIOS menu is password protected. So if you are, for example, buying a device, a used laptop in a shop, then it's a great opportunity to already in the shop see if you can access BIOS. Because if you take home a device that has its BIOS kind of password protected, then it can be very difficult, if not impossible, to remove that password or reset it. If you have trouble with these bootable USB sticks, they might be, if they're difficult to create for you, they might be easy to create for somebody else on a different computer, for example. You might have the easy time creating it on a different computer. It's of course always the case that a USB, for some ironic reason, creating a Ubuntu USB stick is easiest if you already have Ubuntu. Because you don't need to install any additional software. So if your neighbor or your friend already runs Ubuntu, you might as well just ask them for help, hand them a USB stick. For USB sticks, if you are using the USB stick purely to install Ubuntu, then, and later you're going to repurpose it for something else, then an 8 gigabyte USB stick from pretty much any brand except for SanDisk is going to be suitable. And the reason why I say not SanDisk is because most SanDisk USB sticks contain a feature that prevents them from being written as kind of bootable devices. And that has some security advantages. So maybe if you're using a USB stick that you are frequently plugging into strangers' computers, then a SanDisk is great, but they will not work with booting Ubuntu. So you need pretty much anything else. Kingston, Sony's, there's an endless selection of brands. And for the most part, they work really well. So just find something 8 gigabyte. Those also very cheap to get. Follow this guide. So they have a special guide for Windows. They have a special guide for Mac OS. And as you go through this guide, it pretty much just tells you which software do you need to download and which kind of the operating system image. It's called an image. It's kind of like the program you then burn onto the USB stick. Then you plug in the USB stick, you select this file that you downloaded, often 2 or 3 gigabyte large, so it might take a while to download. And you kind of write that onto the USB stick in a special way with the program that Ubuntu provides. And then you can try it out safely on the machine that you're on right now. You can, because it doesn't by default install itself, you can safely just turn off your computer, plug the USB stick in, turn it on, and see if you can access BIOS. And then usually the option is called boot from USB. And as you boot from USB, then you're going to see the Ubuntu menu popping up. And then you can even use it already. You just won't be able to save anything or permanently install anything unless you, kind of make this installation permanent, which typically erases everything on your computer. So feel free to, once you have created the USB stick, feel free to try it out on your own computer. But of course, only install it on a device on which you're comfortable that the entire drive is going to be erased. Any questions about this USB thing? So,
Hey, Leo.
Yeah.
So I'm just kind of wondering, does your node need to be running 100% of the time? Like, let's say you turned your node off for a week. Would it matter when you turned it back on?
So the length in which you can turn your node off kind of depends on your channels. And so theoretically, if you are offline for a long period of time, then your peer is able to defraud you, or is able to at least attempt to defraud you on your channels. And how long this period is, whether it's a day or it's a week, is a configurable setting. So if you plan to turn your node off for a week at a time, then you just have to make sure that the node only creates channels for which the tolerable downtime is at least a week, which is not difficult to do. And then it's entirely up to your peers on whether they keep your channel online or offline, whether they keep your channel, whether they're willing to keep you as a peer. But for the main parts, what peers are looking at is, is the channel used, right? So let's say me as a rational, kind of egoistical node operator, who am I willing to peer with? And then of course I'm willing to have capital locked up in any kind of channel that has activity that earns routing fees. So if your node goes online once a week and then goes offline again, then eventually your peers might think, oh, that's locked capital in that node. But if your node comes up once a week, makes 10 payments and goes down for another week, then that might be like perfectly within what your peers are expecting. So if you plan to do that, I think that's perfectly fine. And I would encourage you to. I would just try to remember there are some settings that you have to look out for to make this safe for you. And of course, so you will later have to, for example, a good practice might be you set your node to have only channels that are able to sustain a week of downtime. And now you need to go online at least once a week or whenever you want to make or receive a payment.
Leo?
Yeah.
Sorry, I have another question. And these may seem ridiculous or whatever, but I just don't know. So can I just run this off my desktop? Or does it need to be a dedicated machine?
Yes, you can run it on your desktop. It's just a little bit more annoying to maintain since we use our desktops a little bit different than how we would use our Lightning node. So if you want to run it on a desktop, then you can totally do that. You can configure it to just whenever the desktop is turned on, the node also goes online. And then, the main disadvantages I can think of is that just you might use your desktop a bit differently. You might want to, for example, turn your desktop off, or and still be able to receive and send payments while you're on the go.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's quite cool how flexible these systems can be, and we'll definitely try to accommodate like as much flexibility as we just know about. For example, you should be able to run a Bitcoin and Lightning node on an Android phone too, but that's just something that's like going to be you're going to run into a lot of little issues because few people have done that so far. But theoretically, also, I was mentioning Android TV earlier. Theoretically, it's totally possible to take an Android TV, not run Ubuntu on it, but rather keep Android on it and then run the node on it. The original idea was always that a node, so we're going to run with LND, which is the Lightning Network daemon developed by Lightning Labs. So you know that I now work for Lightning Labs, and I've run that LND for quite a few years now, quite happily. So it is pretty much the one thing that I'm very familiar with. It was initially meant to be a single binary that runs on servers for enterprise solutions and for home nodes and on mobile, and theoretically it can do all these things, but when they are running on mobile, they tend to be bundled with other software. So if you download Breeze or if you download Blixt, then it comes with an LND node rather than kind of like a dedicated Blixt or Breeze implementation. But that also means that if we want a node that's running on our phones, we do already have a few options. We don't need to mess with installing everything there from source. So yeah, feel free to ask your questions now. Just raise your hand or just interrupt me. I do think you're all aware of the Telegram group. I would expect this Telegram group is a perfect venue to kind of ask your questions whenever they come along. The Telegram group, like the Pacific Nodewest, was specifically created for you. So you're kind of you're the main characters of that Telegram group. And everyone else in there is just there for their and our entertainment. So I'm going to use this group to just make casual comments or share links or resources just as they come up, and only if it's something that I want to very much make sure that you don't miss, then I'm going to send out an email to everyone. Are there any more questions? I think I've covered everything that I really wanted to cover, all the important stuff. It might be interesting for you to kind of, as we wrap up on time, talk for me a little bit about how we're going to structure the next few sessions. So the big ask for this week is that in the next few days you make this decision for yourself. You find the device that you want to run your node on, and you acquire that device. Maybe you already have it at home, or maybe you still need to pick it up, or maybe you need to have it delivered to your home. And that should not take you longer than a week. And also in that week, you should be trying to create that bootable USB. And the one thing to remember here is Ubuntu 00.04. That should be, they also call it the LTS, the long-term support. So by running Ubuntu 22.04, we kind of guarantee for ourselves that at least for the next 3 years, if not even for the next 6 years, we don't have to worry about upgrading our operating system. I think I'm still running Ubuntu 18.04, which is now 4 years old, and I think that has another 2 years left on being support before I'm kind of forced to upgrade. So make sure you pick this one, because if you pick for example, 20.04, then you're going to be forced to upgrade 2 years before everyone else. And if you pick, so they come out twice a year. So if you pick one of the middle ones, then they tend to be supported only for a few months. maybe copy over, or also put it into the introduction. Ubuntu 22.04. The 22 stands for 2022. That's how their naming conventions work. And they release them every year in April and every year in October. And every 2 years, they create a new long-term support version. So try to create that USB stick or a message right in the group if you have trouble making it. If you're around downtown Vancouver, I can also try to pick up some USB sticks myself and then hand them to you sometime. If somehow you can't, for example, some computers might not let you do it.
Hey, Leo, can I just ask one more thing?
Yeah.
So I'm at the Node Academy website. There's the introduction, which works, and then the other chapters, they don't load. Is that because?
Yeah, they don't load because I haven't written them yet. So I've only really, yeah.
Okay.
So I'm going to write chapter 1 in the next few days. And so chapter 1 is going to so these chapters are meant to be read and followed by us as we kind of have our talks. Ideally, everything you prepare for the week should be in the introduction article.
Okay.
I might be able to write some of the details. For example, I think I've put the link to the Ubuntu. I'll make sure that you know which operating system to install and what USB stick to look out for. And then in the next session will split into 2 parts. And I think that's the only one we need to split. So we're going to split between people who run it on a VPS and people who run it on a physical device. Because when looking at the VPS, we're going to have to make very, very different decisions. We're going to, all you then really have to prepare is create an account with the web provider of your choice. So I'm going to follow along with LunaNode, and I'm going to show you what my account looks like and how we're creating inside of that account a new virtual private server. I'm going to kind of go through the decisions on going through the options. We're going to, at this point already, create a SSH key that we are later using to access our node securely. And I would expect the VPS part to not last longer than 30 minutes because it is a relatively straightforward thing to go in there, create a VPS, and then we might already be able to log into it. For the second part, kind of the people who use a physical device, we're going to go through how to install Ubuntu on that thing. So if you want to go ahead, then you're welcome to. But in that workshop, we're going to, kind of we're going to put the USB into these computers. We're going to we're going to enter the BIOS. We're going to boot from the USB, and then we're going to install Ubuntu. And that is, so for that step, it is also very helpful. It makes things a lot easier if for this step you have the ability to connect a keyboard and a keyboard and a display to that machine. If not, then it's still possible to install Ubuntu on it. It's just a lot easier if you also have like a spare display that you can plug in and a spare keyboard, only for the setup operation. For the suggested size, you can comfortably prune your Bitcoin node to any size. I would recommend any size larger than 20 gigabytes. So if you have a 50 gigabyte SSD, then you can totally run everything on there comfortably. If you are using LunaNode, for example, the LunaNode server comes with 20 gigabyte of space. And then I would recommend to rent an extra 20 gigabyte of space for the Bitcoin blockchain. The total size of the Bitcoin blockchain today is about 500 gigabytes. So if you're getting a 500 gigabyte SSD, you're just going to have to prune it a little bit, which you won't even notice because you'll prune kind of the first few years in which there was no Lightning activity anyway. But if you want to really keep the full Bitcoin blockchain, which you need if you want to, for example, run Electrum server or run your own mempool explorer later, then you will need a terabyte SSD. So yeah, there was a question about 256. 256 is going to be very comfortable. So you are going to have to prune your node with a 256 gigabyte SSD, but way more than enough. All right, then unless anyone wants to say something now, I'm going to conclude the session in a miracle 60 minutes. Thank you all for showing up, and please just ask whenever you feel like it in Telegram. I think is the most convenient. If it's something that's more personal or that you don't want to reveal to the group, then you're also always